Hello everyone, today I'm going to share a beginner to advanced guide for the crit system in Honkai Star Rail. If you have any questions regarding crit, leave them below and I'll reply as quickly as possible. Starting things off with the beginner knowledge, we'll talk about the three main damage types. There is break damage, damage over time, and elemental damage. Elemental damage is the most common type and is expressed in skill descriptions similar to this Jingyuan ultimate. Say something like, deals character's element equal to some percentage of their attack, defense, or HP. This is the only damage type that can crit, and optimizing your crit stats for this damage will be the largest damage increase. The 1-to-2 ratio is something you might be familiar with, which basically states that for every 1 crit rate you should have 2 crit damage. So if you had 50% crit rate, you want 100% crit damage built on your character. I believe this is not the optimal way to build DPS characters in Star Rail, however. I believe it's most important to be close to 100% crit rate, as many supports provide large crit damage boosts. Crit rate and damage come from 3 main sources, being traces, relics, and light cones. Using a website like pridewind.gg, see the best relics and light cones for characters you build. As a rule of thumb for crit DPS characters, always want to have your relic body piece have crit rate or crit damage. I would also recommend getting at least crit rate or crit damage as a substat on each relic. That is all for the beginner section of the video, and I will now show some of my characters built around this beginner knowledge, or you can skip ahead to the advanced section. Okay, so here we have Fei Xiao, who I've built according to my own guide and not the 1-to-2 guide. So she has 90% crit rate and 114% crit damage, which is definitely not a 1-to-2 ratio. And another character similarly is my Dan Heng, 84%, and his crit damage is 100.5. And so I will go into combat really quickly and show why I prefer to build characters close to that 100% crit rate, and that crit damage does not matter quite as much on your DPS character to build. Okay, so I've made a team that is relatively free-to-play friendly. Aventurine does not boost the crit damage for Fei Xiao, but I just have him there so that my team didn't die while I was getting this set up. And so, as you can see on Fei Xiao, now that she's in combat, she has 100% crit rate and 240% crit damage. So even though earlier her crit damage was relatively low, just the buffs from March 7th and the Trailblazer was enough to give her well over that 1-to-2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. It is just exactly why I believe that crit rate is far more important than crit damage, as whenever you build a team, usually your supports will give crit damage, and it's not as often that they give crit rate, nor do they give as much crit rate as they can give crit damage. For the advanced section, I'll be talking about crit supports, combat crit rate and damage, and finally the usage of fribbles to optimize your crit combat stats. Starting with crit supports, as of version 3.0, crit rate is always buffed through a flat amount that does not scale. When building your teams, it is important to include this flat increase to your damage dealer's crit rate when building their stats. You never really want to be over 100% crit rate, as this becomes a wasted stat. For crit damage supports, I'm going to take us over to the wiki, as there are many different characters that can boost crit damage. So here we are on the wiki, and we'll go over some of the characters that apply crit damage here. There's Yukong, which, as I previously mentioned, she's a very unreliable support. I would recommend not using her unless you just really like her, or you specifically have built a team around her very weird buff conditions. Sparkle is a character that gives a large amount of crit damage, and she's a scaling crit damage support. So the more crit damage you build on her, the more that your teammate will get whenever she uses her skill on them. And so characters like Sparkle, the Remembrance Trailblazer, Sunday, Rania all have this scaling buff. And I would recommend trying to invest in at least one of these characters for this scaling crit damage buff, as it could be one of the most valuable PS boosts in the game. Some of the notable crit damage supports that give a flat boost right now would be somebody like Robin, or the Herda if you have another Erudition character on her team, and March 7th, as gives her Shifu 60% crit damage. Now, combat crit is what I've alluded to throughout the video, which is basically your character's crit rate and crit damage after mostly consistent buffs from your teammates. I'll show you this in action on my account now, and then showcase how to use the website Fribbles Optimizer to easily see what your combat stats are. Okay, so here is my Jing Yuan on my account, and as you can see, his crit rate is only 63%, while his crit damage is very high, 239%. And earlier in the video, how I talked about how you need that about 100% crit rate, that's where it's more accurate to say you need 100% combat crit rate. And so I'll just go ahead and show you what I mean by that. And so the best team for my Jing Yuan on my account consists of Jing Yuan, Sunday, Robin, and probably Aventurine. And so if I go into combat with them, I command. Use all of my different buffs. Oh, that was unlucky. Fine. And so if I go into combat here, and I get my team set up with the different crit rate and crit damage buffs, just take a short second here, then we'll get to see just how good Jing Yuan is. So whenever Jing Yuan uses a skill, it gives him 10% crit rate. So now he is at 73%. And then with Sunday's skill, it gives some more crit rate. So it puts him at 93.2, and then Sunday's ultimate gives him a large crit damage boost, putting his total stats at 93% crit rate and about 400% crit damage. And so this would just allow my Jing Yuan to hit for a pretty reasonable 490-ish thousand damage. And so whenever I'm talking about combat stats, this is where you want your crit rate to be close to 100%, and then you just want your crit damage to be relatively as high as possible while not giving up too much of your attack or speed. Okay, so here I am on fribbles.github.io. I'll have the link to this in the description. And this is my user ID, so I'll go ahead and put this in. I talked about this website on my top 5 websites video, but as a brief reminder, your characters that you have as Starfaring companions will show up here. And what you can do is typically they'll have a default team with your characters that is basically a hand-selected team that they choose. And I don't really like to use the default ones because you may not have these characters, or you may not like the characters or whatnot, or they may be on a different team. And so what you can see here is we have my Jing Yuan stats up here, which is 63 and 239. And if it used this team that was handpicked, then at the bottom here you see these combat stats, and this is basically the stats after these characters apply their buffs. And so with this team I wouldn't have anywhere near 100% crit rate, but whenever I go to my custom team, which I have in game, which can select this pretty easily by selecting character and the light cone they have. It puts it at this 93% crit rate and 400% crit damage. And so you can use Fribbles to better understand how your characters are going to work and what kind of combat stats they'll have. So for instance, if I was looking at my Fei Shao again, and I wanted to try out a team that I own, but I wasn't sure how it would affect my stats, so then, I put maybe the Remembrance main character with a light cone here, and let's say I want Robin on the team, and instead of Aventurine, let's say if I had only Lingsha as a support. So with this, you could run this in here and see that with this team, your combo damage, this is about how much damage you'd be dealing per rotation. And down at the bottom, your combat stats would show that you're just a little bit over crit rate, but not so much that you really need to worry about it, and your crit damage is good. And so overall, you can see that this team still gives you a good amount of crit rate and crit damage. Although it may not be the most optimal team, it still would give you good crit stats, which I will make more videos later explaining some of these other important combat stats, but for now we're just talking about crit, DPSs, and how to optimize your crit stats. And so with that, I believe that is everything, and again, if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer as quickly as I can. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you later.